Welcome back, guys, to another episode of What the Franchise. In the last episode, we talked about simulation stats, which isn't a very exciting topic, so I wanted to talk about something with a bit more significance and impact when it comes to franchise mode. So in this one, we're going to be talking about the injury system within Madden. So there's a lot I want to get into with this, and if you watch my wish list videos, then you might remember that I mentioned that a wear and tear injury system was originally going to be one of those 5 videos, but I ended up changing my mind and it didn't end up making the cut. But this area is still something that I think is really important and something that I really want to see improved upon. But before I did anything, I wanted to understand a bit more about the injury system, or at least go beyond just the basic knowledge that I had of just what I've seen and noticed looking around injury reports, and actually take some hard data and track some things. So what I did was started a CFM in preseason week 1, simulated each week through the end of the season, not including the playoffs, and then tracked every injury type and the length of recovery, or the time missed from that injury. So first off, I logged 203 injuries and 36 different injury types, and those injury types are what you're currently seeing on the screen now. These range from smaller things like a broken thumb to the most serious one that occurred, which was a 50-week Achilles tear. I'm sure there are more than just the 36 types that I saw, but I'm guessing there's not too many more than that, and that most of the ones that didn't occur are going to be more serious in nature. Also, since I wasn't playing the games, you're not going to see any of those extremely minor injuries where players end up returning in-game. There's just no way to track that, and I'm gonna link the Google sheet that I use to track all of this in the description, so you guys can go through and take a look at that if you'd like. But a couple of things that I noticed when looking at the injuries types was that there wasn't a single ACL tear. Obviously, with something like concussions, that's not even allowed to be in the game, but ACL tears has to be one of the most common serious injuries each year. And just today, Hunter Henry tore his ACL during OTAs. So to not see a single one and to only see a couple of ACL related injuries in general was a bit of a surprise to me. The bigger thing that I noticed though was the complete lack of less significant injuries. Like I said, I'm not playing the game, so that might be something that's strictly reserved for in-game injuries where players return, but still there's no strains, sprains, contusions, or things like that keeping players out for any amount of time. It's all tears, breaks, fractures, dislocations, and pulls, which brings me to the last thing that I noticed, which was that some of the recovery times for certain injuries seemed a bit off. For example, the average recovery time for a dislocated knee was between 3 and 4 weeks, which seemed kind of crazy to me. Same thing with the dislocated hip, where there were a couple of guys where it was only a 5-week injury and the average recovery time was only about 6 weeks, which I thought was odd because I remember that being something that was constantly ending Dennis Pitta's seasons and ultimately his career. But then when I looked up CJ Mosley, who also suffered one during the national championship game in 2012, it said that he could be healthy within 6 weeks, so I'm not exactly sure what to think there. As for the most common injuries, I thought it was interesting to see that dislocated ankles made up the highest portion of injuries. I was expecting to see shoulder tears take that top spot, but it actually ended up second, as you can see here. Dislocated elbow was third, and then you have the old faithful with the broken collarbone, and then dislocated hip was tied for frequency there as well. But as you can see here, going back to what I just mentioned, the most common injuries you're seeing are pretty serious injuries, which isn't what I would expect or want to necessarily be the case. But when you look at the data and you realize that the average length of an injury is just over 7 weeks, it makes a bit more sense, I guess. But that's something that I would definitely like to see tweaked to where that average length of injury is more on the low end than almost half of the season if you're starting on opening day. Moving on to injury length though, here are the numbers showing the length of injuries. One thing you're going to notice immediately is that there were no injuries that were only 1 week in length, and my guess is that this likely has to do with how Big Decisions handles injuries. If you're unaware, with certain injuries, you'll get a big decision to bring a player back from injury, but it can only be with 2 weeks left and not 1. Don't ask me why that's the case, but that's just another little What the Franchise tidbit for you. It's also kind of odd considering that I'm fairly certain the AI doesn't even use the Big Decisions mechanic when it comes to bringing back players early from injury. But looking at the data, you're going to see that just over 80% of injuries are going to fall in that 2 to 7 week range, but mostly in that 4 to 7 week range where they're distributed pretty evenly. But anything over 7 weeks was extremely rare. And like I just mentioned, I'd like to see more injuries fall in that 1 to 4 week area rather than that 4 to 7 week range. Now obviously with this data, like I mentioned, I'm not playing the games and it doesn't include any injuries that occur in-game where the player ends up returning, but it would take a ridiculous amount of games and time played to reach that same amount of data that you're seeing here. Playing the game is likely going to result in some different things, especially when you factor in things like RNG, off the ball injuries and such, but I think for the most part it would end up lining up with what you're seeing here. But now that we've gotten through that, I'll hit on a few issues I have, and the first one is the one that I mentioned earlier, in that there aren't nearly enough, if any, minor injuries. The gap between a player returning from injury during a game and that 3 to 4 week minimum recovery needs to be bridged. This is something that I'm going to hit on more when I cover this in a Beyond the Blueprint video, but there has to be more of those strains, sprains, contusion type injuries where players can play through them but not necessarily be at full health. I don't think the big decision mechanic handles or represents this well at all, but like I said, I'm going to cover that more down the road in a Beyond the Blueprint video. Kind of hitting on that same point though is the impact of injuries as it currently stands. Unless it's a serious injury, there really isn't any impact from those injuries outside of the missed time. You can bring a player back early with big decisions where you get that feeling of playing with an injury, but it's very limited and usually comes at a ridiculous attribute penalty that never seems to be worth it. Outside of that though, injuries just kind of happen and then are kind of forgotten. If a player ends up having an injury during the game and returns, it's pretty much an afterthought once the game ends, and realistically the second he ends up returning to the game. You don't get things like a sprained ankle that a player plays through at the cost of a few points of agility, juke rating, or speed. You don't get a receiver with a jammed or a sprained finger that ends up affecting his catch or carry rating, or maybe transitions his drops open passes trait for a couple weeks. If it's a serious injury, then they can suffer some regression, which is nice, but again, it's very limited in nature. The NFL season is an absolute grind, and you constantly hear how much it's a battle of attrition, but you really don't get that feeling from injuries over the course of the season. Your quarterback gets injured, he misses 4 weeks, he comes back. It's very simple, very basic, and in my opinion, injuries and health over the course of a season is a major foundational element of a franchise mode, and even more so when it comes to a football franchise mode. I think I'm going to wrap it up there though. This is something I could really go on for a long time about and really want to get into more, and will when I do a Beyond the Blueprint video on it, which will honestly probably be very soon. Whenever I do a What the Franchise video on something like this, it usually leads me to outlining a Beyond the Blueprint just because it's fresh in my head. However, it's not going to be the next video because my next Beyond the Blueprint will be focusing on a NFL Top 100 concept with a bunch of new mock-ups, so be on the lookout for that. Let me know what you guys like or dislike about injuries in CFM and how you'd like to see them represented within franchise mode. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and until next time, thanks for watching.